Well, don't be too enthusiastic before I even started. I'm Chantal. I work at a company named DockYard. Some of you may already know it. We are a fully remote digital product agency, and we facilitate products from ID to implementation, which means we have full stack teams with project management and QA and engineering. And you're always free to talk to us and maybe go to our website. It's not here, but it's at dockyard.com. And we have some more speakers from us after me and tomorrow. So I'm the first of three. I'm here to speak about things we usually don't speak about. Like we talk about improving our apps, implementing new features, but we barely talk about the issues we face. So how can we face the issues we have? How can we go forward with the problems we are facing? Well, Ember is growing and developers are using it for even more advanced applications. It's not just a website anymore. Most of you are probably creating real advanced web applications. So the issues that come with that are even more advanced too. And, well, let's be honest, we are developers, but we are not perfect. And we will introduce bugs or find bugs who has been introduced by someone else, but we have to face them. So let's see, how can we face them? Will there be a typical debugging process? Unfortunately, no, there isn't. There is no step-by-step process I can guide you through to find your issue, to find the place where it has been thrown, and how to solve it. It's depending on the issue itself. There is no right solution, never. It's depending on every developer will have a different approach, but I can guide you through some really nice steps and things that could help you. Maybe things that you didn't know before, maybe things you did know. Well, we'll see. Okay, where to start? Like I said, there is no typical debugging process, but when you see you have your Ember application, all our Ember applications are running in the browser. It's a web application, so let's start at the browser. We can start while debugging in our server. The server will have some quite good logs that will tell you what's the issue when you are developing, but I don't want to talk about these issues because they are really useful to just see. I'm talking about the issues in your application, your running application, when your application is, for example, in a test environment, it's in production, and then you have an issue. So the browser. In your browser, you usually start with your browser inspector. And the best way to show you is to show you the browser inspector. So there it is. And I will do some live showing you of the inspector and every part that is needed, because that's easier than just having screenshots. I assume everyone used the browser inspector before. I'm using Chrome, like you see, but most of the tools I will talk about are available in other browsers too, like Safari or Firefox. First thing I want to mention is the Elements tab. It's just, it's not an Ember-specific thing, and you can use it for every web page. But it's a really nice way to see if your elements are rendered, if you have the right class in there. And you can even use this selector to select your element in your page. It doesn't work for this specific thing because I use reveal and that it will have a wrapper all over it. But it will be useful for other web apps too. Another thing is paint flashing. This is a thing I didn't know of before. It can be really useful for Ember applications. Since Ember is using Glimmer and is trying to render your applications part by part and re-render only the thing that has to be changed and not your full page, it can show you what has been rendered and re-rendered. You can find it in your console on the bottom. You have the more tools. And maybe this is really small, but there is a rendering option. which will give you some options. There you have the paint flashing, and I will enable it for just this slide to see what happens. When for example, when I hover over those buttons, then you will see a really nice green highlighting of that element. And it even shows you in your application when the user does some other interaction. Like I have this button and I close, and you see popping up those green, you see? The green elements. And I will move on and I will disable it when it's getting annoying. So the console. We already saw the console. The console itself is always, I think, maybe the first place to look at when you really encounter an error on your application. Errors will be shown over here, and for this application, I really don't have an error yet, so I won't see them. But when there is an error or some information for your application, then it will show up in here. You have a way to filter those errors, and this is my default settings. I don't care about the rest. Like we all know the console log. For just logging some value we have, for example, my application does have the user. And I can log the name, but there is also the console table, and it's really underused. It can show you a better way of, like, for example, an object if you have one, or an array. There's one thing I want to show you. All the code in my slides are runnable, so I just have to click and run this code. And this is what happens. This is what happens when you try to log an Ember object in your table. And that's just because an Ember object has way more information than just the properties you set to it. So it cannot be really useful to use it directly on an Ember object. There are ways to just show the properties you want. The easiest one is just to run it to JSON on your Ember object. But one note to that, it will just show the parts of the object that will be passed to your API. So no computed properties at all. But it's a nice way to show all the properties you have in a nice way. There is another let's see. I will try to show you what happens when you do it with an array. And I have to do the same. Did I miss something? Yes. Like this way, usually you just have a JSON object as an array, like you see below. But it's more helpful to just show the list of all objects you have and the properties that they have. So this was just a to-do list I created for myself this week. You can even use this table, for example, for sorting your list using the headers. So let's move on. Console also has a group function. And I talked to many people who didn't know about this. And let's be honest, I used to be one of them. So I haven't used it a lot yet, but I really like it. I was someone who was putting console logs in my application to find an issue. And I had many functions which I had to debug, and I had the habit to start every function with a really long line of equal signs. And after that, I had a capital name of the function to just indicate that my function started. And it didn't make sense. So I think the group, console group is a really nice solution to that. I will run this example, and then you see what happens. It will have the group name, for example. You can run it without a group name, but it will make more sense to have the group name. And it will be bold, so it will be really easy to see. And you even have, like you see, the group collapsed, which I usually use when you are logging, for example, a loop. I do want to know there is something logged in the group in the each loop, but I only want to see it when I open it because there may be many console logs in there, like I had before. So it's really easy to see what is happening in each function. One thing to mention, and especially for Ember, when you have some async functions, the group starts when you are triggering the console group, and it ends when you trigger console group end. But it could happen that there is a console everywhere or anywhere in your application that will be triggered in the meantime, and it will be in its group. So there might be some console logs that you don't expect over there, but they are triggered during the group, but maybe not on that real location. So that's one thing to consider, to maybe not use it or to keep an eye on it. Then we have the debugger. I don't think I have to explain it, but I will just trigger it to show you what happens. Debugger will always pause on the line in your application. You can do everything with the context you have over there. The only reason why I'm triggering this right now is for my next step, and that's for the handlebars. It's most of the time really hard to debug in your applications, but there are a few handlebars like Ember helpers that can be useful. Like we have logging in handlebars, and I will show you just like the way I did before. And you see it will log everything I have. But the thing I learned later than I learned the logging was the debugger. So in this way, you can even trigger a debugger in your handlebars. And it could be useful even when we have, in the future, we may only have the handlebars and not even have a JavaScript file. Or I usually triggered like computed properties to get the maybe the component context. It wasn't helpful, or it took me too much time to implement those new computed properties. Only thing to mention here is that you don't use this in here. You have context, but you get a nice message in your console, to be sure. In this case, I do have my context model and user and name, for example. So let's go on. And let's stop my paint flashing. I think it will be clear now. So, in addition to the debugger, we have a breakpoint. A breakpoint can be added in your browser itself. It's basically just a debugger, but you can add it in your browser without changing your code. And it can be really useful in debugging test environment or staging or production environments where you can't touch the code. So we just added a debugger in the application file, and that's why I still have it over here. And for example, I have an update value function. It's an Ember concurrency function, but it doesn't matter. I can put a debugger in or a breakpoint. It's basically the same in here. And every time I will change some of these fields, it will trigger my breakpoint. So that's happening. I barely use them in this way, but there's a nice way to add conditional breakpoints to use it and It's just a right click, and you can enter everything that you can do in the console over here. So for example, I could put a console log in this code, even without touching this code. I even can touch this code because it's online. These slides, it's not a local slide deck. I put it online. And I can even watch my values in here. So for example, what I did is put a console log for the key I am changing, and the key is the value of one of these objects and the value that is and a new value. So like you see in here, I will have the conditional logging. This way it could be really easy to put some more logging in your production environment. Same thing as this goes for live expressions. It kind of works the same as a conditional breakpoint I just added, but you have you will need the object globally. For example, in this application, I have a user. That's me, and that's the user we just used. In your console, there is this little eye icon to create a live expression. And here I can, for example, I can watch me. That's not no stalking. That's just me, myself. But let's watch my name. And you see my name over here. And it will change over time. When your object is changing, you see it over here. And I can set my name, like change my first name to my middle name, and you will see it change. It can be really helpful to log one function and not have your full console filled over and see how it changes on every user interaction you make. Another thing is pass on exceptions. The issues you have, it could trigger an exception. For example, I will try to save my changed name, and this will trigger an error in my console. That's because I don't have an API for saving the user. But we didn't trigger a real pausing, and that's why we have in the source tab, in this bar, we have the pause on exception. When you enable this, then every exception that will be triggered will be paused on the place, or on the line where it has been triggered. So let's do the same as we did before. And there it is. And we can debug from there. In this little area, you will have the stack trace from where everything is started and where everything happens, and you can go back and forwards. For Ember, we have some, well, really many async functions, and that's one thing that can throw everything up. Like, we have the stack trace, but the Ember run loop can really mess with that. So it could sometimes be tricky to see where in your stack trace an error was really triggered. Another thing that could be really useful in debugging Ember, and specific to find an issue, whether it's front end or back end, is the network tab. And it's just an easy thing to see what data has been sent from your application to your API and vice versa. For example, we have in here the network tab. You see I tried to save my new user. I didn't have an API, but it doesn't matter for this case. In the request payload, you always see the data that has been sent. This is a good place to see whether your data has been changed when you are saving things. Maybe your saving didn't work. The user told us they tried to change a value and it didn't work. First place for me to start is see what value do I have in here, and then next, what value do I have when it comes back through the API. So that's in the preview, but I don't have it over here, but I can show a little example for the to-do list. I will always show you the JSON that you return from the API. Always to check whether your property name is correct or you have the value that you would expect. Well, that were some general browser console things, but Ember does have the Ember inspector that can be more useful than just these little parts. The Ember inspector, well, Ember has a really good documentation on its website, and there even is a video on there that describes every part of the application, so I really suggest you to look there. If you haven't installed the Ember inspector yet, I would really recommend to do that. It's available for Chrome. It's also available for Firefox using Booklet and some other browsers too. The Ember inspector, I already have it installed. We'll have a few tabs, and I'll start at the components. Over here, you see a list of all your components that has been rendered, and you even have the hierarchy of how it's rendered, like this slide deck exists of a lot of slides with title and content and fragments, for example. The only reason why these components show up in here, no, I have to start earlier. I created this application with just using templates. I'm using angle bracket invocation, and I didn't use JavaScript files at all. I didn't create classes for all these components, so my components didn't show up in here. So when you want to show them, let them show up in here and have to debug, you should have a JavaScript file. Maybe it will change in the future. I don't know. It's definitely, like we heard before, it's a performance thing to have them. But I just created them to show you how it looks like here. When you click one of the elements in whether this components section or even any sections in the Ember developer, Ember inspector, it will use the Ember object inspector. And that is this one. It will show all properties from any Ember object. It could be a controller, could be a route, could be a component, could be a model, and it will look the same for everything. By default, it will be grouped. In some places, I don't know why it's grouped, because there are a lot of unknown groupings, but it probably makes sense in some way. You also could just show all of them, and it will show the most important thing. Except, well, it will at least show your own defined properties. Best thing on the Ember Object Inspector is that you can use the $E sign on top of it to send your object to the console. And then you can basically do everything with your object, which means you can inspect, you can get a value from it, you can change the value, just like I just did with my user. You can even trigger actions on it. So you don't have to trigger real actions in your application when you know the issue is already determined to that one function. And I can even use, like in this case, for me, or I could try things like reloading or saving it without any interaction in my application. Same goes for all the properties that you have in your Ember inspector, like every value you can send with the $E sign. Sometimes it can be useful. Maybe for this it's just a Boolean, so that's not really useful to send to your console, but it can be useful when you have, for example, you have a model that has a relationship, a belongs to relationship, has many relationship, when you have to debug over there. Next thing is the route step, and I don't really have routes in my application, but it will show you all the routes you have in your application, which is IRG, and you even can use the same $e sign or open the object inspector. The data tab is probably the most used tab, and it will show you all models the Ember data store has. Like we've seen my to-dos before, and the list of all of them. For example, my user, this one, it's green because it's a new user, but it's only a little sign. I can just do the same in here and clicking it and putting it into the console, debugging like all the other objects. And that's basically the main thing I could show. There is a promise step that can watch every promise that you will create, like for example, and a container tab, that could be really helpful. That will have like every Ember object you have in your application. I really use this sometimes when I want to do things with the store, and I just choose the services and the store. Like you saw before, I used metered store because my user has a store, but this can be a better way to just trigger actions on a specific service you have in your application. The promises tab will show you all promises that will be rendered in your application and the status of it. And I can show just a little thing by getting, I don't have it anymore. No, I don't think this will trigger. Oh, that's weird. Oh, for some reason I don't have my $e anymore. And my me and everything. Well, that happens sometimes. Let's move on. Every step I just took was a manual step. And it takes a lot of effort to take them and a lot of time to see where the issue is or where it comes from. So I would really suggest to put some automated logging over there. Ember has its features for that. There are some transition loggings, and it's specifically useful to see all your routing. There are some other views, controllers logging. You can just enable this, and there's a really good guide on the website. Another thing I want to suggest is to build in some Ember error tracking to catch every error you have in your application. That way, you don't have to find the issue yourself. You don't have to wait until one of your team members or your project manager will tell you about the issue. Maybe even your user will tell you about the issue. And that's worse. You want always to be a step ahead of your user. So try to build in some error tracking, and the first step for that will be the Ember on error and catch every error you have. And you could even send it to, there are a lot of services to catch them. And they will have a nice stack trace or even show everything where it comes from. Well, about the stack trace is one thing. In your production environment, source tree are enabled or disabled by default. So to have a meaningful stack trace, you really should enable source maps. That's maybe one thing to consider. There, like I told you, there's a lot of services, and I don't know all of them. I think I only used the first three. It's a really nice way to get triggers of errors you have in your application. And you could even be your user a step ahead Or maybe your user tells you they had a problem, and you can see where the problem was triggered without having them to ask everything. Or maybe there's something they don't know. Well, some other small tips. We had a lot of tools in the browser to debug. I know there are a lot of tools for editors specifically, but everyone is using a different editor, so I don't want to spend some time on that. There's a really good README on the Ember website. Take a look at that. And some tips like use those services I just told you about for tracking your Ember errors. Make sure you have useful stack traces. It can be really hard when you are having issues with run loops, but at least try to have your source map to determine your issues from outside those services. One thing that hasn't to do with errors, but maybe to avoid them, is write tests for your applications. And keep your application simple. When your code is simple, when it's readable, at first it will avoid more complexity and more issues, and it will even be simpler to read it and solve your issues. And of course, everything that could happen, it's maybe you get stuck on it. And it's not bad. We all get stuck on issues, and we spend sometimes like hours on debugging issues, but it's always useful, and it's always a place to learn your application. Maybe you've seen some lines that you didn't see before, and you're not alone. You can always ask for help. You probably have teammates that can help you out. They have another view on your code. And we always have our community. So don't be afraid and take every problem as a challenge. And that's the only advice I will take you. And still try to talk about the issues we have. But for now, make the most of Emberfest. Thank you.